Hi, I'm Jessica Breyer, and my project is on Cuba. I'm going to go over 6 different topics about Cuba. First is the history, then the geography, the politics, economy, the values and the customs and traditions. The history of Cuba begins with the indigenous people. There are 3 different groups of indigenous people and cultures. The first were the Guanahabis, and they were the oldest indigenous people to Cuba. They were what archaeologists call a shell culture. They were very undeveloped. Many of them lived in caves, and they usually scavenged for fruits, and they also fished for fish and mollusks. By the time the first settlers came there and the first discoverer, Christopher Columbus, they were dying out and they were almost extinct. So the only thing we know from their culture is through ruins and burial sites. The next indigenous group was the Siboneyes, and they were the second oldest indigenous group in Cuba. They were what archaeologists call stone culture. They sometimes lived in caves, but they usually built small dwellings, and the dwellings were called baharics. And they inhabited the western part of Cuba and southwestern peninsula of Hispaniola. The Tianos were were a very important indigenous people in Cuba. They were the largest expanded group of indigenous people that lived in Cuba, the Tianos. They also inhabited parts of Hispaniola, parts of Jamaica, and parts of Puerto Rico. They lived in small villages, and their homes were called Bajayos. And then when Christopher Columbus came, he was the first to discover the area for the Spanish, and that started the colonial era. It was in October 27th of 1492. He was on his way to the Indies. And he said that the land was the most beautiful place he'd ever seen. It was beautiful, fertile land that he discovered for Spain. And the Taino Indians actually greeted the settlers because at the time the Taino Indians were in a sort of battle, a long battle with the Caribs, and that means cannibals. And the cannibal Indians had been battling with them for a very long time, but the Tayanos realized that the cannibals were afraid of the settlers because they were foreign to them. So they sort of used that to their advantage and tried to remain somewhat protected, hiding behind the settlers so that they could cannibals could flee the area, but unfortunately the Spanish just took over the area anyway from the Tayanos, so it was a lose-lose situation. Even though the Tayanos did get the cannibals out of the area by using the settlers to scare them off, then they didn't get to keep any of their land anyway. They also, once the colonists came there with Christopher Columbus, they did start to settle the land and colonize it. The Spanish used Cuba for a stopping ground for the Spanish fleets when it was exploring new parts of the New World in South America. And in the 1800s is when Cuba really started to flourish and prosper because the Spanish government decided they wanted to use Cuba to create many plantations, and they imported a lot of slaves there. They were the number 1 producers for sugarcane in the area, and they also started producing a lot of tobacco. And because of the attention and the wealth they were getting because of Spain being such a strategic property in Spain and strategic asset to Spain, that actually kept them loyal to Spain much longer than a lot of the other Latin American countries. So their fight for independence took place slightly after most of the other wars for independence did in Latin America. The first war for independence started when the Creoles, the descendants of the people that were chosen to rule the area by the Spanish, decided they wanted to govern themselves. The first war for independence was called the 10-Year War, and the first war lasted from 1868 to 1878. It was unsuccessful, but there was a second revolution that lasted from 1895 to 1895. 1898 is when it ended, 1898. And it ended because the U.S. actually started to intervene with the Cuban revolt of independence. The U.S. had interest in the area, especially with building the Panama Canal at the time, and they wanted to the U.S. remain the only major governing body in the area. They didn't want to compete with listening to Spain or having to go they wanted to have most of the control in the area. They didn't want Spain to be a contender. So they actually ended the Cuban Revolution in 1898 because they signed the Treaty of Paris that ended the Spanish-American War. And with that also granted Cuba protection underneath the U.S. that they would have freedom away from Spain, and they became their own nation of Cuba, and they would also have U.S. protection against Spain at that time because of the Treaty of Paris. The geography of the area, to give you a bit of that, it's located in the Caribbean and Central America at the entrance of the Gulf of Mexico. It's the largest island in the West Indies and also the westernmost point of the islands of the West Indies. It consists of smaller islands also around the main area of Cuba and small inlets and cays. And most of the terrain is mountainous on the southeast and the south central area, but it's flat everywhere else because they use it a lot for agriculture, very important. And the area, it's a little bit over 42,000 square miles, and that's comparable in size to Pennsylvania. The capital is Havana, and it has about 2 million people, but the total population of the country is a little bit over 11 million. And the capital is 2 million, and the whole country is about 11 million. Other large cities include Santa de Cuba and Guantanamo and Santa Clara, among some more. The economy, the basic economic structure is that it is a socialist economy, so they don't have a free market like we have here. The government pretty much makes all the decisions about the economy and any changes to it, and they have to adhere to very strict laws that the Cuban government enforces with their economy. They have natural resources of cobalt, nickel, iron ore, copper, manganese, salts, and timber and silica, and petroleum. Their industries include sugar and tobacco, as I mentioned, petroleum, construction, nickel, steel, cement, agriculture, agricultural machinery, and pharmaceuticals. And also some of their agriculture there, sugar and tobacco, of course, citrus, coffee, rice, potatoes, beans are some of their agriculture. Their GDP per capita is just under 10,000, and their exports are a little bit under 5 billion. A little bit over 4.5 billion, I would say. And they usually export sugar, nickel, tobacco, fish, medical products, citrus, and coffee. Their imports are just under 13 billion a year, and their imports are petroleum, food, machinery, and equipment, and chemicals. The major trading partners that they do still have with Cuba are the Netherlands, Canada, Spain, Italy, Russia, China, and Venezuela. Venezuela has been a very strategic partner with them because of the previous leader of Venezuela was Chavez, and he really looked up to Fidel Castro, who is the current leader of Cuba, as I'll mention in a few moments. And so they had a very strategic political and economic alliance there as well. The politics of Cuba is that they are a communist state, and the history of their politics that led to that was in 1901 there was the Platt Amendment, and that granted the U.S. the right to intervene with their military when they saw fit, when they thought there was a need. Now that did help the Cubans at the time who were struggling, but also it sort of weakened them because it left them susceptible to a lot of holes to be created within their political systems because they were really more reliant on us. And the U.S. did that really to protect their interests in the area, to have remain control. And authoritarianism has been a big problem in Cuba for so long. It continues even still to this day in some sense with the current state of communism there. But the authoritarianism began to rise in the early 1900s to 1930s. And there was a dictator there named Morales. He was one of the first dictators. And he, in 1930, was forced to resign and flee the area because there was a lot of revolts there. And the U.S. actually had picked a new leader that they wanted to lead Cuba. His name was Caspidis, and the U.S. really wanted him there so that they could protect U.S. interest in the area as well. Well, there was a gentleman by the name of Sergeant Batista, and that didn't sit well with him. He gained a lot of followers within the new recruits in the military, and he actually created an uprising against the military, against the the U.S.-backed candidate of Céspedes, and he overthrew that, and he declared himself, Batista, the new ruler of all the military in Cuba. He also made the Cuban military had a lot of more power within the political decisions. So, in essence, he declared himself a big political leader, basically, by force. And eventually, in 1940, he did declare himself president, and he was supposed to serve until 1944, but of course he didn't end there, and he ended up serving as president, or really dictator, until 1959. In 1959, there were several battles, culminating in the Battle of New Year's Day in 1959, when Batista was overthrown by Castro and his political movement. Castro is a very important political figure in Cuba, and the Castro movement, his followers and him were called the Authentic Party, or the Cuban Revolution Party. They overthrew Batista, and Batista had to flee and go to Portugal. And Castro was a big believer in communism, and he really was the one who cemented that within Cuba. He's been ruling all this time since 1959. And in 1960, the U.S. had an embargo against Cuba that still exists today, that we don't do a lot of trading there. And also, in 1961, there was a CIA operation, a secret operation, in 1961, and the code name was called Bay of Pigs Invasion. The CIA wanted to go into Cuba and overthrow Castro. But unfortunately, Castro had so much security that they ended up getting captured, and it was sort of a big embarrassment and big problem for the U.S. because the CIA operatives were captured, and Castro had the opportunity to say that he triumphed over us, that he destroyed the Yankees, and that they were stronger than us. So, of course, it was a big blunder on our end, and empowered Castro because he sort of won that battle. Also, there's the Cuban military crisis that happened during the Cold War, when Castro was hiding missiles that belonged to the Soviets. He was hiding them in Cuba, and when we found out about it, we didn't want any mistakes to happen, the missiles to go off basically in our direction, and we made an agreement with Castro saying that if he dismantled the missiles, we would basically grant him protection, that we're not going to retaliate. And that was the Cuban Missile Crisis that we've all heard a lot about in the history and in television and everything. Just to give you an overview of the politics of the recent day too, from 1990s until now, there are several things that have happened. Obviously, the Cuban illegal immigration has been a big problem. Basically, the problem of the Cuban illegal immigration is known as the Balsero crisis that started in 1994, where they come over on rafts. But of course, this is a big problem because, one, it's illegal, but secondly, the quality of them trying to flee their country, the quality of living for them, and the safety of this is really dangerous. And a lot of them don't make it here. They get diseases or something happens along the way. So it's a very dangerous thing and brings up a lot of human rights issues. That's one of the political problems going on right now between us and Cuba. Another thing that brought the Cuban-U.S. relations into the media again was in 1996, when there were stricter sanctions between us and the U.S. To reinforce the embargo, and that brought into question the political problems between our country and their country. Once again, it questioned if we're doing the right thing with the embargoes, because we still trade to a lot of the partners that they trade with. So even though we don't trade directly with them, we might trade with Canada, and then Canada trades with them. So it was forced to be looked at again in 1996. And let me see. Also, what's happened recently is that Castro is very ill, and he's basically on his deathbed right now, and what he's done is he's still officially in power, but he transferred most of his power over to his brother, who's in charge of the military, and his brother is the head of state and the armed forces. So his brother's basically running the show right now, even though Castro's officially still the leader. But he's really on his deathbed right now. He's very ill. People don't think he's going to make it. And even though there's a lot of censorship in Cuba, more there than there really is any here, a lot of the new messages in the media have been anti-socialism, anti-Castro, anti-communism. So the movements of revolution, the whispers of revolution that have been in Cuba for a long time, are starting to sort of get empowered because Castro is very ill. So we're really looking at a turning point here that things could really change rapidly. If once Castro is deceased, then we could really see some big changes, and we could see a big revolution within Cuba. So we're on the cliff, basically, of that. We're on the precipice of that. And to go over the values also, it's a little difficult to research their values because there's not a lot of information that they themselves have put out there because of censorship. But basically, they have very common values like the rest of the people in Latin America, and like we have here. Education is a big value to them there because it's really something they cling to. That's one of the only good points of their life, because education is free there. And what happens is, if you complete elementary school, middle school, essentially, and you start high school, you're required to do that. But then you can drop out if you want, or you can continue. If you do choose to continue with your education and finish high school, then college is free there. And so that does give them some great opportunities, and we're seeing that the workforce there is becoming more educated. So education is a big value of theirs. And also the value of family, of course, is huge there because, that's where they gain their strength. Most of the families are either mixed families between the descendants of the African slaves and descendants of the Spanish. And the household structure is going through a lot of changes recently. Publicly, the man is really in charge of the house, but behind the closed doors, really, the woman is in charge. And we're seeing a big revolution with the women there because they're becoming very educated and a big part of the workforce now. Now the government has made daycare free for everyone. Also, on a side note, they've made birth control free. There's also a very controversial thing where they've made abortions very accessible to the women. That's very controversial, but I guess the government is trying to encourage women to be in the workforce. So women over there in Cuba are really doing it all. They're still raising their families, they're still doing all the housework, yet they're a huge part of the workforce now. I read in one source that over almost 50% of all the doctors in Cuba are actually women. So we're seeing a big revolution between women empowerment in Cuba as well. Also, for the religion is also something that's very important to them. They are predominantly Roman Catholic, and Castro, what he tried to do is he tried to diminish the Catholic Church's power in Cuba. He didn't want anyone loyal to the church. He only wanted people loyal to him. So he closed down all of the Catholic schools. He really made it very difficult for you to go to church because you're afraid that the police would harass you. So people are still do practice their beliefs in their home, but going publicly to church has become a problem. So a lot of people are practicing more at their home and praying there as a family. Also, the customs and traditions. The wedding ceremony in Cuba is a really big deal. They have a huge, very high divorce rate in Cuba, and a lot of people are speculating that the emphasis is really put on the wedding in Cuba and not so much on the importance of the actual marriage itself. A lot of people get married like at least 3 times in Cuba, at least, by their 30s or 40s. So the wedding ceremony is huge, very colorful, very, very loud, lots of guests. It's a very big thing to show that you're now part of the adult society there. Also, another tradition is music. Of course, they are the rumba, the cha-cha, the mambo. Very important is their music and dance there. Comes from the European and African ties of the colonial days that they come from. That's where most of the instruments and dances are from those old days. And also the Spanish guitar was influenced from when they were under Spain. Then also baseball. Baseball is actually a huge national pastime of theirs, just like ours. That's largely in part due to that Castro was a huge baseball fan and played baseball all the time. So it was very favored and encouraged for the people to play baseball. And also during the first revolutionary wars there, the 10-year war, the Spanish actually banned playing baseball altogether. So what they would do is they would play baseball in secret, and then all the money that they gained from those secret baseball games, that was used to fund the 10-year revolution. So it has a big tie to the feeling of revolution there, baseball, so that's why it's so important to them. And basically, to summarize, Cuba's faced a lot of different hard things like communism and oppression, but the people there still remain very strong, and they really have a feeling that almost like we have the American dream here, they have a similar idea there, that they know that their lives will get better, and it's really all about passing on a better life to their children. That's why you see a lot of immigration because of the turmoil in their country. But hopefully now that there's a lot of different changes to come with Castro being sick, hopefully now we'll see more of a revolutionary force there, and hopefully they can overcome even more of that oppression, because they are very strong people. And that's my presentation. Thank you.